Hello, good morning. My name is Anne Iveson and I am Senior Advisor of the Collar Institute of Private Equity. I'm here today at the Private Equity Findings Symposium at London Business School. Joining me now is Professor Viral Acharya, who is Professor of Finance at NYU Stern. Hello, Viral.
Hi.
Can you tell me, after your lecture today, do you think that the large private equity firms should be considered as and regulated as SIFIs?
It's a good question. I would say for most part, no. But I will describe some shades to it where I'm less convinced that everyone may not be a SIFI here. So a traditional private equity firm usually only had equity investments. And typically a fund is structured is really through a lock-in of the investments which are made by the limited partners, most notably pension funds, some high net worth individuals and so on. So even though the underlying companies in which private equity invests are leveraged, there's a sense in which the private equity fund itself doesn't have a leverage of its own. Its investors basically, in some sense, effectively own the companies that are being managed by the private equity fund. When you look at systemic risk issues, they are invariably always about leverage. They are about short-term leverage in particular, because that can basically exit the door at a quick notice, which is precisely the idea of having a short-term debt in the first place, which is you can withdraw and refuse to roll over at the moment you wanted to. And you need some sort of a correlated exposure across a wide part of the economy. So a series of institutions get hit at once, they are funded with short-term debt, and as a result you get sort of disintermediation of these entities. As we have seen in this crisis, private equity funds were holding on a pretty rough portfolio of deals, I would say. Some of these deals were clearly financed with cheap credit that was available in the period before the crash of 2007. But they've had a relatively soft landing, in my view, in the sense that you don't hear about the winding down of these funds. You don't hear about a sudden withdrawal of money all in one night from one of these funds. So you're sitting on Friday and you're thinking about, oh, when things open on Monday, is the world going to fall apart because there's all sorts of interconnections to this entity and so on. So they clearly had a correlated exposure, which is they were reliant on the credit markets, they were reliant on the macroeconomy continuing to do well. But because they are not significantly leveraged on their own, the shock did not blow out of proportions in terms of their disintermediation, their liquidations, and the spillover costs onto other entities they might be connected to. So in this sense, I feel private equity is basically in some sense quite well capitalized. It has very little leverage, if any. There's some leverage in the sense that if you do well, you can set up your next fund well. And so when you don't do well, there is some disintermediation in the sense that it's going to be harder for you to actually put out your next fund. But I think those, if one was to estimate what's the leverage that arises through that, it's probably not that substantial. Now, on the flip side, so therefore my broad answer is that they fundamentally look different from banks. Now, where I would say there are shades into this answer is one, a lot of banks in the past have owned private equity funds of their own inside their bank holding companies. Now, this is a case where even though the private equity fund by itself, in some sense, is not leveraged on its own, its investor is someone who basically has a ton of leverage out there. So for example, if it's JP Morgan's private equity fund, clearly JP Morgan at the bank holding company has a lot of debt. Its various subsidiaries have a ton of debt. Some of this is even guaranteed by the government. And so the equity that is built at the bank holding company is partly supported through a lot of leverage in the economy. This is an example where I would say clearly one should pay attention to what they are doing, because the shock to the bank holding company could arise through the leverage at the bank holding company level. And it's not just private equity that's supporting that leverage, it's also all kinds of other much riskier, potentially riskier businesses. So this is one area, and already at least in the United States, the Walker rule partly gets at this. It limits the investments of bank holding companies to just 3% of their tier 1 capital into these kinds of funds. The second area where I think there is a gray shade to this is that a number of private equity sort of family of funds have now become publicly listed companies. Of course, this is a new trend, but I think there's at least 3 or 4 of the largest funds out there that have done this. Now, the reason for this might have been that, the partners, the general partners wanted a cash out of their stakes, and they are sort of, in some sense, realizing liquidity for all the future funds that are going to get set up in this business, rather than having a very illiquid claim out there. But there's no reason to believe they can't actually raise leverage down the road. They are now publicly listed companies. They can do whatever they want. They are not just structured anymore, just like the traditional private equity fund used to be. Now, suppose, let's take an example of one such company. Suppose, let's say it's Blackstone. Suppose they go and basically raise a ton of leverage, but then they are supporting a large number of private equity funds. Now it basically starts looking like a bank holding company structure. And I think this leverage one has to pay attention to. A number of these larger private equity funds are also setting up their own subsidiaries to raise debt in the market. Now, they are primarily for now raising debt for the companies that they fund, because they sort of want to do it all in-house rather than paying a premium to the banks for doing this business. But you can see that if this activity becomes very successful and they get very good at it, they might actually want to start dipping into raising debt capital of their own. So my preference on SIFIs generally has been not to come out and say someone or some sector is not a SIFI. Because the moment you say that, you've given them basically a blank check to become a SIFI. Because they're going to be outside of the regulatory perimeter that's going to be applied to SIFIs. But you're basically telling them, yes, you can remain out, but I'm not necessarily going to restrict you. So I think a good measure would be to investigate all large pockets of intermediation on an ongoing basis. Say hedge funds, private equity, banks, broker-dealers, boutique investment banks and derivatives arms, money market funds, whatever the whole gamut of institutions out be there. Visit them on an ongoing basis. See what kind of leverage trends are actually building up. Has there been a fundamental shift in the PE capital, the capital structure of PE businesses? And I think that if some of these gray shades that I described, the bank holding company owning PE funds inside, and so effectively having a leveraged PE exposure, or PE funds over time actually issuing debt of their own, I think these are trends that should be watched out for. And if they become large, their leverage becomes large, I think it is something that you might want to look at more carefully. Now, there's a distinction here. The Walker rule is not going to be applied in Europe. It's not clear that the European bank holding companies can't do PE anymore. So I'm sure a Deutsche Bank, if it wants, can continue owning a PE fund. And so I hesitate to make a blanket statement that it's not SIFI in an absolute sense. I think there are PE funds that are leveraged out there in the world. They are sitting inside bank holding companies, and one should look out for those.
Thank you very much, Varel. So you're saying that we need a better watch on the characteristics rather than the organisation itself going forward from here?
Absolutely. I think the functional form, the fact that it's called PE, should not be what makes it non-SIFI. It's really the leverage characteristics of how the funds are structured, which should really be the determining factor in the end.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anne.